Hello and welcome back to Talks with Teas. Today we're talking about dry January. Lots of people tend to partake in dry January, don't they, after the festivities? And when we were thinking about topics for our podcast, we thought this would be a good one, didn't we? Because it's lots of people have enjoyed the festivities, let's just say, and that's absolutely fine. We're not here to criticise what people choose to do. The reason that we tend to get involved and have issues and the court gets involved is in the context of child arrangements and when that has been drinking to excess or drug taking, and that's when it becomes a problem. I think that's what we're talking about today, isn't it, in the context of safeguarding and the welfare of the children.
Absolutely. I think it's a really important topic, especially when you're in the kind of environment, if there is a relationship which does have these issues. It's really easy for us to see looking in objectively, but when you're in the kind of midst of this, your potential alcohol addiction or drug substance abuse, I think it's really important to understand, in particular with the children, the impact this may have on them. So I think it'd be quite helpful to kind of move to two questions, so to speak, but albeit lead. So one, can I stop my ex seeing the kids if I'm worried about drinking or drugs? And I suppose on the kind of flip of that, can my ex stop me from seeing the children if they say I have an issue with drinking or drugs? And I suppose what can be done in both these scenarios, either through solicitors, other support networks, the court if required. So maybe might quite help for our listeners to just explain a little bit about the law.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you know, the presumption in family courts in our legislation is for children to have contacts and spend time with both parents as long as it's safe to do so. And I think that's really the crux of what we're talking about today, is that we need to be sure, as the family lawyers, courts need to be sure, CAFCAS need to be sure that it is going to be safe for the children to have contact with whichever parent it may be that there is an issue. In line with what we were talking about at the beginning with dry January, we're not saying that if you drink that it's an issue. It's just that if you're drinking to an excess, there are going to be concerns for the children. That's when it could potentially be a problem. And so I suppose just very simple answer to your question is yes to both of those. The answers to both of those questions is yes, technically, you can be stopped if it's seen as a risk. So I think, I think it might be helpful if you talk about some examples that we sort of see in the everyday where this comes up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what we see kind of a mixed range of level of abuse, shall we say, substance abuse, from severe alcohol addiction to complete dependency on cocaine or heroin. Not so much heroin, but it seems cocaine is a commonly used drug for families of all levels of disposable income. And some of the issues that we kind of see is perhaps, drugs being left out. So, maybe cocaine, white powder being left on the sofa. There's been children, in the vicinity and picking it up. And that sometimes can be just, brought into a conversation. And when, our clients are in these situations and live in this, in this home environment, that this becomes a normalized behavior, that these drugs are lying around the house. And actually that's quite serious, quite understandably for children and, for the obvious reasons.
And it's on that it ultimately is why the court's concerned with it, isn't it? Because I think what parents may find, especially if they've been ordered to do, say, hashimoto testing, which obviously we're going to talk about in a minute, but is, why am I being forced to do this? Why isn't it an issue? And we're not here to talk about the legality of any of that. It's more about the fact that we have to have a concern about their safeguarding and their welfare, and if they're going to be able to be cared for when somebody is under the influence. And that's what the court is ultimately concerned with, because when it comes to children, as we both know, it's what is in their best interests. That's it. And that's what we say to our clients all the time, isn't it? It's not about you, and it's not about the other parent. It's not about the grandparents. It's not about anyone. It's about those children and what's best for them. And is it what's best for them to be around someone who's under the influence? Okay, so I suppose our next point was, the question comes up a lot, doesn't it, about can one parent insist on there being some sort of testing done? if they've got such concern about the other parent, for example, taking drugs or drinking too much, can they insist on a testing? And I suppose it's not, again, there's can never really say yes or no, can we? But I suppose the best answer is technically no. You can't insist on it because you can't force somebody to do something as the other parent. You can say, as you were talking about, in terms of our children and what's best for them, in order for me to feel safe and to be sure that this is going to be safe for the child, then yes, I want you to do it before you have contacts. And we as family solicitors often do suggest that, don't we, in correspondence. However, ultimately, if you're going to need something ordered, insisted, then you're going to have to go to court, aren't you, to get a court order?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if we're in a more formal arena of court, yes, a judge can order drug and alcohol testing. I think that's certainly their courts within their scope of powers that they can order. But if it can be managed outside of court and that can be regulated between the parties, mum and dad, and that alleviates any stress or anxiety over concerns impacting the children, again coming back to the children, then that's equally fine. Yeah. And I suppose that comes on to what type of testing we kind of commonly see.
Yeah.
And it's quite a broad spectrum. Some are more forensic than others. Hair strand testing, which Katie will explain a little bit more about.
What normally happens is they take a bit of hair from the back of the head as much as possible so that they don't have, it's not seen. And ultimately what they're testing for, isn't it, is drug use, alcohol use, and they can go back quite a long way. So the standard is normally 6 months, isn't it? And we will get a report back, and the court will get a report, and it will say this is how much drugs has been consumed, as much as they can. And it's extremely scientific, so I'm not going to try and go into that.
Very forensic.
Forensic, that's the right word.
Yep. Is there any others that we tend to see? I think the breathalyzer, hair strand testing, there is blood testing potentially.
Yeah, blood testing I've seen. Obviously, when you're talking about the breathalyzer and the difference between when you're doing the investigation for what's happened before and then what's happening.
There is that contrast. So just to clarify for the listeners, the hair strand testing looks kind of retrospectively back, whereas the breathalyzer obviously presents as it is on the current day.
We as family solicitors, parents, the court, we're all trying to make it work, aren't we? We're not trying to stop contact, trying to find ways in which a child can see their parent as long as it's safe. So if, for example, breathalyzer, that means that we can be reassured that it's safe for that person to have contact with their child, then brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, what usually happens, just for our listeners who are not familiar with this, but if it was in a contact centre and there was a positive testing on a routine testing, to our understanding, the contact will be terminated. I think that's kind of how it's dealt with. It's not ignored or referred back to solicitors. You've stopped. It's not safe. Again, go back to the children and their welfare and best interests at heart.
And I suppose it's also, without going down another tangent, but I suppose it's also about communication, being open and honest, especially when you're in court proceedings. Ultimately, if you have taken drugs or you're drinking in excess, the best way to deal with that is by being open and honest and saying this is what's happened. So I think the issue with the breathalyzer is if you've said that you haven't done it and it comes up on a breathalyzer, then there's issues with
credibility, honesty. Yeah, absolutely.
Just a lack of insight into the harm that's going to cause. So I suppose we have covered, I think, most of the arrangements. So I guess that's what we were just talking about. Communication, transparency, being focused on what are the core issues in order to be able to ensure that contact can continue in the best interest of the children as long as it's safe. And I think that's just really, if anything's taken away from it, it's not that anyone, the core CAFCAS is trying to put these testings in place to make people's lives difficult. It's to ensure that the children are safe. So thanks. So that brings us to our conclusion of this episode. Thanks very much for listening. Next time, we're going to be interviewing our partner, Helen Midgley, who is a accredited mediator, and she'll be talking to us about all things mediation in advance of Family Mediation Week.